This, I think, is going to be a very interesting conversation. So over to you, Mark and Libby.
Thank you. We also really, it was funny, we were like, well, we won't say too much, and then we can really get the audience happening. And so, and then we just got going. And
The back room, we're already going at it back there. We didn't even know we were beginning.
But Libby said, aren't they announcing us? And so you help us with that, though. At some point, if we forget, like, somebody start cutting in and making sure that we engage with everyone. And maybe we'll be able to do that fairly early on, I hope. What we're going to do then, I'll say, as we agreed to, is that I'll make a couple of remarks about sort of the goals behind what I do and what led to my book. So it's similar to, I already had a chance to talk about this earlier, and then Libby will do the same, and then I'll open up with a couple of questions for her, get something going, and she'll do the same with me, and then hope to open it wider. So that format works for everyone. As I said the other day, and as the intro just pointed out, I work at this area. I'm an economist. I got into economics because I was very active as an environmentalist as a teenager, and thought I want to learn about economics so that I can help go toe-to-toe with the powers in our society. And I feel that's how I've tried to live my life. My graduate students, 30 years of graduate students, are around the country and the world in very good organizations, the David Suzuki Foundation, the Pembina Institute, the Climate Institute, governments, International Energy Agency in Paris. And what we do is try to help make sure that people like you can know if the promises of politicians and the policies they implement will actually coincide. So those policies will hit the promises. And as my career has unfolded, I was doing that initially, so helping with climate policy design. How do we actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And noticed that I and other experts like me around the world were always almost saying the same thing, whether it was 1989 or it was after the Kyoto Agreement in 1997. And so this got me more and more interested in working with political scientists, policy advisors, people that advise politicians at a very detailed and disaggregated and polling, riding by riding, swing voter level. And that's what that brought me to the idea of thinking about how to really help at the margins get those more climate-sincere politicians into power and ensure that the climate-insincere politicians were not in power. And in doing that, though, a lot of compromises are required because not all Canadians think the exact same thing that you do or have the same priorities when they vote. And I feel that requires a certain maturity of all of us. We're in a democracy. We're not in some kind of, I don't know, eco-dictatorship or where we all are going to think the same thing. And so if we want outcomes that we think are critical to humanity, like rapid reduction of greenhouse gases in Canada and the rest of the world, I'm going to argue that we need to be hard on ourselves. We need to look in the mirror and not just righteously say, that politician did X, which is inconsistent with what I want, and even though I'm, by attacking them, I'm going to help an even worse outcome happen, I don't care. They weren't good enough for me. So what my book is about is how to help people identify those politicians, and you do it by understanding a tiny bit about policy. You don't have to know much. And a tiny bit about what needs to change. And you don't have to know much. You just have to know about electricity, and don't burn coal, transportation, don't burn gasoline. So that's what I've been working on and thinking a lot more about how to help the right side get reelected, but then even more important, and I'll ask that later on maybe, is lots of people know that, I'll use examples, lots of people know that our NDP government in British Columbia is has allowed a natural gas pipeline for liquefied natural gas on the North Coast. And so then I'm going to ask you, what are their other key climate policies, and what would happen if that government gets flipped to another one? And so what are your thoughts strategically on what you ought to do? So that's sort of where I come from. And so now I'd like to stop there and pass it over to Libby so that you can give us yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And as you can see, I'm taking up the whole sofa. And I got here first, and I said to Mark, I'm sitting on the sofa so I can spread out. He goes, are you going to lie down? I said, no, yeah, I might. So he got the chair, I got the sofa. And actually, the first thing I want to do is give a very good shout out to a wonderful friend and our host, Sue Hamill. Wave your hand, Sue. Sue Hamill was the MLA in Surrey Green Timbers for many, many years, from 1991 to basically 2017, with a small period in between where she wasn't. And she was a cabinet minister in many portfolios, so in some ways I feel like you should be up here, maybe in this chair, because you were there, you were in government. And so, anyway, you've been a wonderful host to us on the island, so thank you very much. And to Jack, your four-legged friend. It's been wonderful to be here. And so I'm very glad that the festival put us together, Mark. At first I was a little bit nervous, okay? Because it's like, he's academic, so I thought, well, you are. I mean, okay, he's a bigwig in academia. I'm not. I'm a university dropout. I went to UBC for 1 year, dropped out, went to the downtown east side, started raising hell on the streets, organizing, and, I went on a different path. And so I thought, this is going to be interesting. But then, I've been thinking about it, heard you yesterday, and realized that we do have a common thread, and that is we both do want to see change happen, right? So I was elected, you were not. You were in the public policy world in a different role, and you've moved more and more into that. And I've been in the public policy world too, and so I do think it's a very interesting question. And to remind you what we are talking about, it's breaking down challenges of making change happen. So what is that? Like, what are the challenges and how do we make change happen? And I've always been very interested in the idea of transformative change. And when Mark and I were already getting right into it in the green room next door, we both agreed that we're pragmatists, and I think that comes from my municipal background, where I learned, you're hands-on, you're right there, you're doing what has to be done, and I know, Jack Layton, who was the leader of the NDP, he was the same way. It wasn't, like, so where I strongly agree with you, I'm not a purist. I think it is easy to be like that and to expect perfection out of politics. I don't, right? It's a system you have to navigate. It's a system that you have to work within, but that doesn't mean that there aren't moments and times where you do have to be very bold and you have to be willing to speak out. And in talking to Sue last night, I was saying to her, if we went back to the Dave Barrett government in 1972 and think about something like the Agricultural Land Reserve, it was incredibly controversial. There were developers against it, there were industrialists against it, there were landowners who were against it, and the NDP had this big idea. And so I think where this conversation is going to be interesting is how much and where do you compromise, right? Whether you're a voter or whether you're in elected office, and where are those moments where you can make those bold gestures and stick to it? Like, think about Tommy Douglas and Medicare. The doctors went on strike in Saskatchewan. He took on the whole, doctors who were revered. But he was like, no, this is the right thing to do, and look at us today. We're so fortunate, and we look at what happens in the US, where 40+ million people don't have health care. So for me, it's very nuanced, this idea that you've got to think big, and I call myself an idealist pragmatist. I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but in my own head it isn't. I know what I'm fighting for. So yesterday when Mark was talking about agenda hitching, I was like, I think I do that. And he was sort of saying, well, you know, he's not a big fan of agenda hitching. I do want to change people. I do want people to see a bigger picture, right? And I'll, work on an issue. And so for me, transformative change and the challenges is understanding that you are working within confines that can be problematic, that can be challenging, and you have to learn how to work it. And I know Sue learned this every day in politics, right? You have to push it as far as you can. But there are moments when you do have to stand up and say, I'm going beyond. I'm like speaking a truth here because there's some kind of line, that you don't want to retreat from. But anyway, I'll stop there and let's get into our further discussion.
Right, and so now I think you talked about this, but let me ask you a couple of questions because you just led into that well it's. I'll say them both, but I'll remind you if you don't answer them. One is, if you forget, I forget, so I'm not saying she forgets. Well, for example, you were mentioning local, as a local politician versus a federal politician. And we can get to that later, but I would be interested, and maybe others, in the differences there. Let me give you my hypothesis is that as a local politician, at least I tend to think of local politics as something where you're more connected to the voters and there's this community sense, and that federal politics would be more difficult. Now I know you weren't in government federally, but I'm just interested, and maybe others are, if you want to comment about contrast there.
Absolutely, and there are big differences between municipal and even provincial and federal. Most municipal governments are much more non-partisan in their approach. So, for example, in Vancouver City Council, which is very small, 10 members, a mayor, so it's 11 members, each person really counts. There wasn't really a government per se. Now that did change when Gordon Campbell became the mayor. If people remember, he was the mayor of Vancouver before he was premier. And interestingly, Mark, he did change the style. He brought in much more of a sort of cabinet style, because he did have a majority, and Bruce and I were in, quote, opposition.
Right.
But prior to that, it was much more, each member was equal. And I really learned this when I went to Ottawa, right? Where it's much more an institution of the government, the loyal opposition, and all the other parties, the second party, the third party, the fourth party, sometimes even the fifth party. And so it creates a very different dynamic. And so I do think that municipal, and this is why people who are interested in getting into politics, the municipal arena is really wonderful because it is really close, it's really hands-on, and your voice really does count. Like in Ottawa, when I first got there, I had to really figure out, what the hell am I meant to do? I'm an opposition member. The Liberals have a huge majority. Like, what do I actually do other than, spouting off in question period, which is really just theater?
Right.
And so I actually had to kind of relearn dynamics to figure out how to work in that environment, work with what was considered my political adversaries to win things that I think were important for my writing.
Well, and listening to you yesterday, you talked about, wanting to decriminalize and have safe injection, and then realizing, I've got an NDP colleague in Newfoundland. And so, this will come up later when I might say, why would a Trudeau government support a pipeline, an oil pipeline, because of thinking of Alberta, which is not the same as being in your community. It's, Canada's this huge country with these diverse interests. So I'm thinking about, how did it affect you, even strategically, going on to this federal state? Like, how did you respond to that colleague in Newfoundland?
Well, I just kept arguing and trying to bring forward evidence and truth about what was going on, right? And I'm sure I really ticked off a lot of people. But I do think it's the way you do it, and I'm sure this is the same in your work as well, right? If you kind of get on your high horse and people think you're just venting or you're just like, going on, you turn people off. But if you're actually trying to engage, and I was speaking about this morning, that engagement is so important, right? Even with your adversaries, I think you can then begin to find some commonalities, which I think leads me to a question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, in your book, and you touched on it just now, you speak about climate sincere and climate insincere, and people might be surprised to know that you name Trudeau as climate sincere, and there may be people here who don't agree with that. So it's very curious to me how you came up with that and how you actually think it's working. And will it actually produce the kinds of transformative change that we need? Like, at one point, do you say, okay, that person was sincere, but they blew it, and now they're off my list? Like, do you have, a benchmark somewhere?
I do, and it happened with Jack Layton.
Okay.
So Jack Layton was a municipal politician, and after Canada signed the Kyoto Accord, he was the deputy mayor of Toronto, and so he was set to be a co-chair of the municipal table for all across Canada. And they picked my group to do the modeling, because we do cities and how you can change urban form and have more active transportation and transit and do buildings differently and density nodes and so on. So we worked all that together, and I got to know Jack. And then at various times, federally, I've always helped Elizabeth May federally for climate policy, and I helped the NDP federally at various times. And so we were running into an election, and Jack said his policy had nothing to do with either regulating how we heat our homes or drive our cars, or price. Like, no carbon tax, no charge. And I said, Jack, you don't have that in there. And he said, we're going to make industry pay. And I said, actually, you can't make industry pay. It's a global problem, and our industry and the workers depend on those jobs, whether it's steel, cement, aluminum, are traded internationally. So let's look at social democratic governments in Scandinavia where they're in power. They're not in opposition. And I said, what do they do? Well, it turns out, so this is like, I forget what year this was, 2008 or 9, or I'm not sure, 2011. And I said, in Sweden, if you or I bought a liter of gasoline for our car at a gas station, we would have to pay a carbon tax of $150. Okay, thanks to Trudeau, it's now up to $50 in Canada, but if the Conservatives win, we'll get rid of it. $150. If an industrial firm in Sweden buys that same liter of gasoline, they will pay $5. Industry doesn't pay for a global action problem. And I said, Jack, every social democrat in power in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they all agree on that. So shouldn't you at least say to Canadians, it's not true, we are all going to have to pay for this, not just industry? And Jack said, you may be right, but no, that won't sell. So to me,
that's off your list.
To me, he's a wonderful person who I loved, and he's a great Canadian, but he was not climate sincere with Canadians. So it could be anybody. It could be the provincial NDP under Carol James campaigning against Gordon Campbell's carbon tax. It can be when you least expect it. But you want to know how I determine climate sincere. You have to read the book. It's going to be, do they have the 2 or 3 policies that reduce our emissions? And that's how it has to happen. And it's really easy to know what they are. And I mentioned this yesterday. It isn't Rick Mercer commercials. It's a rising carbon price, and it's regulations, and they're very difficult to do politically. And Jack knew that, and Jack didn't want to say that.
Well, okay, Jack Layton's not here to defend himself. Above that, and give people a different picture. So I think, some of this is subjective, you know, it's like my memory, my experience versus your experience, and what you saw as the primary questions. So it does really get to the question of, like, if you have this formula of what's climate sincere or insincere, like, is that subjective, right? Or like, what is it, you know, how scientific is that?
Right. So around the planet, it's complicated, but I'm an author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that can sound a little wishy-washy, but I do work with a group of academics from Stanford University who develop models so that we can run the policies that governments say they're going to do. And I do that almost every election, and I've done it for quite a long time, and I did it back then, and I was very aggressive against the Chrétien government because the Chrétien, we would run their policies through, but I wanted to use Jack Layton for the obvious reason that you're NDP, and that could be a fun challenge.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, well, when we were first emailing each other what we'll talk about, I give her a long list of NDP stuff I would go after, but yeah, and she's like, you know, maybe we won't do that. But actually,
he's got a long shopping list.
yeah. But let's go back to, and I'm happy to keep talking about this, but there's just so much from your experience that people should know about too. And you and I talked about one thing here just briefly before lunch that I thought would be fun to bring out. And because a colleague of yours and someone who is a dear friend of mine as well is Sven Robinson. And I was asking you about your relationship with Sven when you were both as politicians. And so what you and I are both talking about a little bit is strategy, technique. We may be very similar in the things that we care about and want to see, and yet we can look like we're far apart because we may, you know, in the kind of voting and electoral systems, and whether it's community or federal in a diverse country, we may look at different kinds of strategies and techniques. And I asked you about you and Sven, and you said, yeah, we were so close, and yet we had some very different approaches. And I think what you said fascinated me, so maybe you wouldn't mind just describing that a bit.
Well, Sven is my very good friend still today, and I see him a lot. Both Kim and I see him. And we were both in the federal caucus, and I think both sort of considered on the left wing, the left side of the party. And we did have very different approaches, and Sven and I would often have spirited arguments about what we needed to do, right? And I think it comes down to what I was speaking about this morning, and that is how you approach different questions, how you build relationships. And I have enormous respect for Sven, because in some ways the role that he played in our party, in the NDP, was to be that trailblazer, right? Was to be the person to say, no, that's not right, and to say it publicly. And I always felt that my role was to say that sometimes, but also to find other ways to come at it from inside, right? And that's where this sort of inside-outside comes from. And so that can create tension, right? When do you kind of go out guns blazing, and when do you not? And it becomes a very, I think it becomes part of your character and who you are. So it just as you and I are having this spirited discussion about how change happens, I agree, I think we have the same kind of goals and we want the same kind of outcomes, but how you apply that it can be so different on, you know, who you are, where you are, what stand you take at what point. Because I don't think you can, you know, kind of go out on everything a battleground, right? At some point you're destined to lose, right? And so, you know, that old idea of picking your battles, right? And who are your allies, and building those relationships. And not that Sven didn't do that. He was very good at working in different governments, and he was one of the few MPs who actually got through a private member's bill through both the House of Commons and the Senate. And he did that because he worked all sides of the House, right? So I think what it speaks to is that change is very dynamic. it's always fluid, and this is what I think I would like people to understand. When we think of politics as a very static thing, and there's, you know, those bad guys, and then there's people that you might see as the good guys, well, it's very fluid. It's very fluid, and it's within that space that we're negotiating all the time, and figuring out where do we push, where do we make that bold moment, or when do we kind of work the back rooms, right? I mean, I think that's what makes politics so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And if we could, back there we talked sort of another level, if we take it now to a voter's decision, right? So you do help make public policy. You work with all kinds of different governments. You have your ideas of climate sincere, climate insincere. How does that translate when people are actually voting, right? And we were getting in a little bit into this whole notion of strategic voting, and what does that mean, and where do you make those choices when you're a voter? So maybe we can pick up on that a little bit.
Sure, and I think, and that's sort of what we were talking about just before we came up here, but I actually think we're probably similar. Some people will say, so I basically say, I wish we had a system of proportional representation.
Yeah.
I think that's a much better system.
Yeah.
And actually, I think if we put it to a referendum, most Canadians would vote against that. Your fellow Canadians. And there are reasons for that. Just fear of something different, unawareness of how effective it could be in Scandinavia, again, using the same example. And so that's unfortunate. But I sort of always try to demand of myself and a lot of young people in my life, because I'm a university instructor with very large undergrad classes in sustainable energy and a graduate program. I try to force people to, at all times, be strategic, to be always thinking about what is the best I can do. And now in this case, as a voter or a campaigner. And on the strategic voting issue, I do believe people should engage in strategic voting, because I believe that in a pluralist system that we have, your objective should actually be to avoid the worst possible outcome. Sorry, you're not probably going to get what you want, certainly those of us who are more green and left. And so I will vote green when that's the best chance, and I will, you know, and it could be that sometimes you switch. There's a whole bunch of, in Westminster, I used to always vote green because I knew the NDP would win, and I wanted the green percentage to be as high as possible. So there can be all sorts of elements to how you vote.
So let me, I'll respond to that,
Okay.
but let me just kind of put this to you. If you had power, you said you thought the people of Canada would never vote for PR, and in BC we had, was it 3 referendums?
Mm-hmm.
We've had 3, right? They all failed. And I have to say, the second one, what's the other system that's not PR? It's
So there's ranked ballot, there's STVs.
Okay, single
transferable vote.
Right, okay, I actually spoke against that, because it was so damn complicated. I couldn't understand how it worked, and I thought, I can't support something I don't understand how it works, so I voted against that. The next time it came around, I voted for it, because I thought anything is better than what we have, so I actually changed my mind. But if you, Mark, if you were elected and you had the power, would you just bring in PR?
No.
You wouldn't?
It's a major constitutional issue. That's what I think. I mean, I have to respect my fellow Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
So,
what about if you campaigned on it and you won a majority and it was a big part of your mandate?
Then hold a referendum.
So you'd still hold a referendum?
I mean, we're getting into some intricacies now. Nathan Cullen had a great idea in that, you know, when after Trudeau got elected, was this idea that we would bring in something and keep it for 2 elections and then hold a referendum. And I like that idea because I think a lot of people vote against proportional representation because of fear of difference. And so, you know, there are different strategies.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is strategy of how you get there.
Yeah.
And so my point was that I wasn't saying that Canadians will never vote for that. I was saying I have to be mature right now and accept they don't have that. And they might not bring it in the next 10 years, but I need rapid action on climate in the next 10 years. So it's immature of me to say I'm going to campaign only on proportional representation instead of how to make sure that Poilievre doesn't become prime minister. And that's what I was so disappointed in, that Stephen Harper got power and then even a majority with about 40% of the vote.
Yeah.
And we needed to prevent that.
I think though that, well, first of all, you don't have to campaign on one thing, right? There can be a number of priorities. And what I find disappointing is that when I see, for example, the Liberal Party campaigned, it was a promise to bring in PR, and then they abandoned it because it was politically expedient to do so and not in their interest, although they may change their minds now because they're beginning to realize that it's harder and harder to get a majority as the way, politics polarizes or the pluralistic system. But to come back to your strategic voting, I don't generally disagree with what you're saying, but I think people have to be very aware that strategic voting can also backfire. I believe very much that you should vote for what you believe in, because if you don't, you'll never get to where you want to be. So that's the idealism part of me. The pragmatic part of me says, yes, when people are in their own riding, they'll make an assessment. But I've also seen situations where people voted for, say, a Liberal because they thought they were stopping the Conservative, and they ended up actually defeating an NDP member who was working against the Conservatives. I saw that many times. So the idea that you vote for what you believe in, right, I think is very important. Otherwise, we all get reduced to kind of the lowest common denominator, and we end up sort of compromising with what we actually want to see happen. And this is where I think this intersection is very, very interesting, right? Is at what point do you say, no, I'm going to stick with this, I'm going to move this agenda forward, even if it's pushing it uphill, as opposed to I'm going to go for kind of the low-hanging fruit, I'm going to go for really what is a compromise, right? And I think that's very attractive, but in the long term, it can also set us back.
So that's why I was asking you about local politics. I can't imagine ever being a strategic voter in local politics, for example. So I was really thinking about a large, diverse federal country and those challenges. And I'm talking about real differences. If Stéphane Dion had won that election against Stephen Harper, we would be in a very different place in our national greenhouse gas emissions. And that's going to mean a lot, because it's about Canada and what Canada does to help motivate working with Europeans and others. And this means something important for poor people 10 years from now, especially in the poorer parts of this world. And so this is real. And the idea that, oh well, I won't be strategic voting, and if Stephen Harper gets in, so be it. I'm going to stick pure to what I know. We've even seen, so what I'm saying is, look for people who maybe are not the same as you, but you might be able to work with. And that's what's going on federally right now. The NDP are working with the Liberals. Yep. We're getting amazing policies in climate. You probably don't even know it, but we're in the process of this. So we're putting in a zero-emission vehicle standard like BC and California have. We're putting in methane regs that are very good. The clean fuel standard has just come out. The clean electricity standard, I have signed all these non-disclosure agreements. I just looked at the latest version of that. It's very close to what I helped design for the David Suzuki Foundation. We are looking at amazing federal policies, and my IPCC colleagues say they make us leaders in the world. And I sit here just terrified that instead of some kind of NDP liberal government, that for some weird reason, a scandal, who knows what, Pierre Poilievre will get into power, like Stephen Harper, and we'll have another 10 years. And by the way, our greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, in British Columbia, they kind of went flat. In Canada, they've gone down, except all the growth is from the oil sands, which were all investments approved under Stephen Harper. So those of us who helped, or who didn't stop Stephen Harper from getting elected. That's on us.
But didn't we have the worst record of the G8 of meeting our targets in Canada?
So if you remove the huge growth in the oil sands, and I just published a paper on this, Ontario goes down, Quebec goes down, the rest of Canada goes down between 2005 and 2020. We map perfectly onto Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany. So no, it's just Alberta's oil sands growth, and those were investments approved just before Harper and while Harper was in power. Anyway, we should. Yeah.
Yes, I'm cognizant of the time, and we're finishing at 2:45, so we've got 20 minutes. So maybe we should open this up. We hope that you folks have some feedback, some comments, some thoughts of your own. So just. Yes, I can't quite see everybody, but I see a hand waving. There we go.
I had the privilege of asking the question of Libby Davies this morning, so my question now is directed to Mark. Never mind perfection, just the bare minimum that we need to do, the bare minimum that you believe we need to do to save the planet. Can we do that within the capitalist system? And my second question, a lesser question, can we achieve what we need to achieve in Canada without electing a Green Party government or an NDP government, or at least elevating one of those parties into opposition? Thank you.
Yeah, so capitalism is pretty good at wanting to stick around. It's also incredibly rapacious, and it encourages selfishness. And Canadians, by and large, keep voting for political parties that believe in a capitalist system. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And so what you might say to me is, so are we in despair? Because we're unlikely to get Canadians. So we'll have to campaign on Canadians voting enough of them to elect an NDP government. And I would argue, go ahead and keep doing that, campaigning on that, green NDP. So caring about equity, as the Greens do as well, but so those two parties, instead of two parties that basically believe in a market economy, and so go ahead and keep campaigning on that. But please don't do just that. Figure out when you need help with strategic voting. Look at other countries. Sweden, and I do a lot of work in Scandinavia, these are very capitalist countries. I'm sorry to tell you. So their electricity systems are now at zero emission. They're rapidly moving their transportation systems to zero emission. Buildings in Sweden are completely zero emission. Industry in Sweden is rapidly moving to zero emission. This is a capitalist country. So Norway's emissions are rapidly falling, even though they have oil as an oil exporter.
I would add one thing to the question, and that is, I think it's really easy to sort of, create compartments on this issue and that issue and that issue. And I'm interested in the kind of politics that is actually producing connections for people. So to me, climate change policies are really important, but they're equally as important to ensuring that people have good jobs and not putting one against the other. And so, for parties, and some parties do that and some parties don't, right? And for my own party, the NDP, I feel like that's been a very central question. And so I do want to see a political dynamic and process where we're actually growing the movement, but we're growing the understanding of what's taking place. And for me, that does include the capitalist system and how it is destroying our earth. And I don't see you can separate the two. And the more people are getting connected and understanding that, the more change I think will come about. So anyway, that's just a response to that question.
But I would like to just throw in there, capitalist or industrial society, wealthy industrial society. I mean, the environmental destruction of non-capitalist countries in Eastern Europe and in China prior to its market was phenomenal. So let's be honest, it isn't just capitalism that does that. It's that fossil fuels are fantastic for bettering people's lives, and paying attention to the environment is something that we're not as good at. We make trade-offs, and our governments make trade-offs. And that happens whether it's capitalist or not capitalist. Co-ops in the United States were the biggest ones to make contracts with coal plants in the 70s and 80s. So, co-ops, you can go through any system you want. Fossil fuels are amazing.
Yes, the woman right here.
One question for you, one for Mark. For you, you say there's a point where you need to stand up for
Yeah.
a truth. And so if you would talk a little bit more about that in the sense of climate and women's rights, both those things being tricky. And Mark, something more about the pipeline? It'd be interesting to hear what.
Well, I mean, I think it's personal, you know. When you're elected, you're part of a team, you're part of a caucus, and I believe very much in that. I'm not a lone operator, you know. I want to help build my team. Dr. Goldman talked about that, right, yesterday, teamwork. I believe very much in that. And yet there are times where you feel something is just so fundamentally not right that you have to. So we all have a choice that we can, you know, we can resign. We can say, I'm sorry, I can't be a part of, and that, you know, we have many examples of that in politics where people have said, well, I'm sorry, I'm stepping away. And in fact, I was telling Mark earlier that some of my arguments with Sven were over that, like, where do you get to that point? And it's a struggle. I mean, this is not an easy question. And I've always felt like I should do as much as I can within the team, right? Even if it means I'm kind of on the losing end sometimes. But there were times when I knew I had to speak out, right? And it was when it was something that was so core to what I believed in. And I mean, I'm actually thinking now around my riding in East Vancouver, and I was fighting for changing drug policy so people who use drugs were not criminalized. And even within the provincial NDP, it was a very touchy issue, you know. And I remember there was the Attorney General at the time who was sort of peddling this idea of drug courts, which has been pretty well thrown out in many places because they don't work. It's the idea that if you're a drug addict, you either get treatment forced on you or you go to jail. And to me, it's a completely false premise. I mean, people who have smoking addiction, we don't say to them, you know, you're going to go to jail unless you quit smoking, right? And I had to speak out on it. I had to say, no, this is wrong, right? Even though I was taking on some of my provincial colleagues. Now, the way that I had to do that, I had to be careful about it. I had to be respectful about it. So how you approach that is very important. And in terms of women, actually Sue Hamill has been, you know, an absolute leader in like bringing women's equality to the system, even particularly within the NDP, like changing the rules, actually changing the rules, and saying women are not going to be relegated to, quote, unwinnable ridings, right? Yes, sure, we're going to run lots of women, but actually we're going to stick them all in places where they don't have a hope in hell in winning. And so changing that. So some of these debates take place internally, and they're full of tension and can be full of conflict and opposition. So again, it gets back to, I think, the point of being needing to have allies on the inside and having people on the inside work for those changes as well as in the broader community, because when they go together, it becomes a very powerful voice. But, you know, I can't tell you categorically, you know, this is when you speak out and this is when you don't. I mean, I think each person arrives at that place depending on what it is and where they are and how they feel about it, you know, just like you do in your own life. You know, when do you take that stand?
Right, TMX. It cut me off after 2 minutes. I just find it a really fun, not fun, but as you can see, I'm trying to provoke people a little bit just to challenge yourselves. And so I'm going to do this though by trying to have some credibility to you in advance of my statement. I was the City of Vancouver's lead expert at the hearings for the Trans Mountain Pipeline to try to stop it. So I presented evidence of why we should not build this pipeline. I wrote op-eds in the Globe and Mail criticizing Trudeau and saying, do not build that pipeline. I appeared before US Congress to try to stop the Keystone Pipeline as a witness of environmental groups. And then I toured European capitals and met with leaders of governments, with James Hansen. It wasn't me they wanted to see, it was James Hansen, the climate scientist, to try to get them not to water down the fuel quality directive in Europe, which was a directive that would prevent oil sands from being exported to Europe. So I've also been arrested to block coal trains. So I am very aggressive on climate in my efforts. But I am finding Trans Mountain an interesting one when people will say to me, in British Columbia especially, it's so much fun, Trudeau is building this pipeline, so he's climate insincere by that one indicator, and therefore I won't even vote strategically or whatever to try to prevent, because he's no different than Poilievre or Andrew Scheer or whoever he's running against. So that's why I bring that up.
But how do you feel about it now?
We should not build it, but it is not an indicator, it's not a sufficient indicator of climate insincerity. We happen to have, if you think of Stephen Guilbeault and Jonathan Wilkinson and the influence they have in that cabinet and the policies they're implementing, the coal plant phase out, leading in the world, and especially connecting that to powering past coal initiatives to get this happening where it needs to happen in the developing world as well.
But Mark,
and policy after policy like that.
But let me put this scenario to you, and I don't want this all to be on the climate crisis because we're talking about change overall. But anyway, that's your field. But what if your voice were added to it, right? You're a big influencer. So what if you, just as you protested, and I think you said you went to jail or you were charged or something on coal, and I mean, what if you were out there?
Right.
Like,
so
think about what influence that would have, right? So if you've let that go, because it's not the key point.
So I did that, and once they bought it, I knew they were going with that. And so then the question is...
So you don't think that will change?
No, and I think, but also, I challenge everyone to pretend you're the Prime Minister of Canada. It's not what you are right now. It's interesting, it's kind of fun for you to do that. So I do remember that in the constitutional crisis we had, in the last one in the early 90s, I was working on climate policy. And then for 3 years, no climate policy interest nationally in Canada. Why? Because of a national unity crisis. So let's pretend I'm Prime Minister, or you, or whatever. We're sitting there in Albertans, and just remember, people can be really irrational. And it's not just Albertans, it's any of us, if we feel we're slighted. So if I were Prime Minister, and I knew, because energy experts like me will tell you, that oil markets are, us building or not building that pipeline has no effect on the global demand for oil. Any expert will tell you that. I'm sorry, it's not me, it's any of the experts. They're credible, smart people. We have no effect on the global demand for oil. So keep a government in power that has said, I'm going to make this trade-off. I'm not going to fight a constitutional battle with Alberta for 3 years and wipe out all the other climate policy we're doing, because it'll take all the air out of the room, this constitutional fight. And believe me, there are people in Alberta who are fixing for a fight, who say, and in fact, I even was just following who are the people who are going to run now to replace Jason Kenney. And I forget, Danielle Smith or whatever, wants there to be an initiative for Alberta separation. So if I'm the Prime Minister of Canada, in a diverse country like that, I could well make a decision to say, build the pipeline, and let's get that off the table so we can implement the stuff that closes the coal plants, that gets gasoline out of cars and diesel out of trucks as fast as possible. So now you don't have to agree with that. But I'm like this. I still think maybe he didn't need to do this, but I understand it. And I'm just asking you to be understanding in a complex world, rather than righteous and purist. Because I don't think that helps you get your outcome either.
But it didn't work.
What didn't work?
It is working.
It is working.
Alberta is still ticked off. Alberta's not the lowest.
So there's no investment.
Did everybody hear that?
Oh, sorry.
She's saying it didn't work. And I think it does beg the question that if we don't act because we fear what might happen that will be worse, it can lead us into a really weird space.
Yeah, but this doesn't. That's why I just gave you the evidence. This doesn't increase the demand for oil. What decreases the demand for oil is policies like the zero-emission vehicle mandate that this government federally is implementing. I'm helping to design that. They're linking up with California and with Norway and the rest of the Scandinavian countries and China, and this is changing the world, and the demand for oil will go down. It is working. Sorry.
But that oil is still, those fossil fuels are, I mean, even if our emissions go down, they're still going to be exported and used somewhere else, and so that may increase somewhere else.
So my point was that, no, the demand for oil in Vietnam, in Pakistan, is independent of what Canada does unless we're part of a world that is moving. Oh, we're also doing a zero-emission vehicle standard for large trucks that is part of moving the technologies that we use that use fossil fuels. Closing coal plants, shifting the transportation system, and we're done. That's 3/4 of the problem right there, and that's what the government's working on. So I cannot honestly tell you it's a climate insincere government. My colleagues are like, oh my, you must be so happy to be in Canada with a government like that. And I'm like, well no, a whole bunch of people are gonna help to get Poilievre, or it was Andrew Scheer, or Aaron O'Toole into power, and we'll be right back with 10 years of Stephen Harper.
We've just got a few minutes left, and we want to try and get in a few more questions. So why don't we take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll just try and respond to them and close up. So this lady here, and then the hand up at the back, and the lady over there. Okay, so.
Okay, so one thing that I've been watching that I think is really important was the First Nations on a national level deciding to cut off pipelines, that they were going to not let any pipelines go. And they have been also working on that, independent of whatever our issues are. And so I'd like to hear your comments on that, because in fact, there have been quite a few pipelines across the continent and in Canada that have been stopped.
Okay, just hold it. So the gentleman at the back, and then the lady over there.
Thank you. I'd just like to point out, I'm not a gentleman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The discussion about agenda linking, I want to look at it on 2 sides. One, I agree very much. If you spend much time in the former Soviet Empire, you won't see it as a left-right issue. They've done everything as bad as the Poles and in a lot of different places. So I don't see it as a valid dichotomy. You know, left is on the right side of it, especially climate change issues. On the other hand, yesterday, Mark, and I wanted to come back to this, and I'm sorry for the content, but for a lot of us, that's the compelling issue at the moment. On the climate agenda, you described Seth Klein's book as an example of this agenda linking thing. And of course, he does go in Naomi's direction eventually when he talks about all these Paris deals and so on. He wants to set up out of the Second World War. But you missed, I promise you missed his essential point. Klein and go over that book with a fine-tooth comb. His essential point is that we're really deep doo-doo. This is a serious existential crisis on a par with the 1940s, and that's his message, is if we're really serious about getting out of it, treat it as though it is, because otherwise we're not going to. We're going to be going down without a fight. And my question is, do you really think, I understand all you're saying about the possibilities and so on of our current governments, but are they doing it? Are they treating it in the way that Klein is suggesting, not linking it with all the leftist agenda that he gets into later in the book, but in treating it as an existential crisis that requires that kind of response? Are they really doing that from your perspective?
Okay, and over here?
I'm just wanting to, if you would discuss a bit about old growth forests, the Fairy Creek episode, versus jobs versus Aboriginal rights.
Okay.
You do that one.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
The other two are for me. I'll be really quick. So First Nations have signed on to a lot of pipelines. So I kind of have to disagree with your idea about that. And on the QT, I've been helping several different First Nations groups that want to buy into pipelines, and I can't say any more about that. So First Nations want economic self-determination, and it's like sometimes on the left or Greens, we sort of think, oh yeah, they need rights to the land so they can hunt and fish. Well, a lot of them don't see it that way anymore. They want rights to the land for economic self-determination and maybe even approve a lithium mine one day or whatever. So be careful with that, I guess, is my response. The second one is, with all due respect, and Seth, I know him, we get along, but it's kind of like, that's backwards. If you say, this is kind of what Libby and I were talking about, if I'm really screaming about something and I'm not able to compromise federally in Canada or whatever, that shows I really take it as a crisis. But if there are people that are actually trying to work within our political system in order to get the policies that I've just listed for you, isn't that someone who's treating it as a real crisis? So I actually believe that it's such a crisis that we don't have time to also say, I'm going to convince all Canadians, or I'm going to convince 50% of Canadians to get rid of the capitalist system. I'm going to need to say, there's policies right now, let's get them implemented.
But I think Seth's saying that too. I mean, I think he's also very pragmatic. He's trying to show a bigger picture about what is causing the crisis, but he's not saying we need to wait for some perfect state of union that will allow us to, I think he's arguing for realistic things that can happen right here and now to make those changes.
But he's not saying that that doesn't give him the right to say he's treating it more as a crisis than Trudeau is. Trudeau or Jonathan Wilkinson or Stephen Guilbeault, they are getting Canadians to vote for them to get into power to implement policies, and they recognize the crisis.
But unless Trudeau is getting the pressure from people like Seth and Naomi and all of the movements, and so this gets to the Fairy Creek, then I don't think we'll move forward. So it's not either or, right? And to get back to the Fairy Creek, which, again, I'm not an expert on, but I'll try and tackle it. And you made a reference that there are First Nations who support pipelines, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that there are First Nations within the colonial Indian Act system who have been set up by the federal government, and within that world, there are also elders, tribal elders, who don't agree. So even within the First Nations Indigenous community, this is a very lively discussion and debate, and there's tension and there's contradiction. And why wouldn't there be? Of course there would be. There are people who have power, who see an economic interest, fine. But there are also people within those communities who see it another way. So, and in terms of Fairy Creek, I would say I believe passionately in the power of public protest. I came out of the peace movement in the 1980s. I swam around a warship. I know that there are people here who were very involved in the Nanoose Bay and stopping the testing of the cruise missile, for example. And if it hadn't been for the power of people's movements to put pressure on governments, and sometimes it's the hardest when the government in power you see as your ally, right? It's hard, it's really hard. But I think it does come back to, again, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow, I hope, in the lobbying workshop, it's how do you apply that pressure? And sometimes a public manifestation, right, and that visible public pressure that comes from like people's gut, right, is really powerful, and it produces transformative moments that does put pressure on John Horgan and his government. And that's okay. That is totally okay, but there also need to be people who are working on other levels. So, for Fairy Creek, I think it's a part of a very important debate in this province about, what policies are implemented and how we move forward. Anyway, folks, it is 10 to 4.
on for quite a while. It was pretty interesting, and I'd like to say thank you very much to both Mark and Libby for being here today to do this discussion with us. Pull out your tickets. So, the draw is going to take place. I'm going to hustle up a little. So, I'm going to stir them up. And Libby, would you draw one, please? What's the prize? Oh, I'll tell you. Because it's to come back and do more, right?
Round two. Yes, the last three numbers are 930.
And yours?
935.
Okay, 930 and 935. Who's got them? 930, 935. Okay, try again. Anybody got 930? Going once, going twice, gone. Draw
So just drop it.
away. Easy come, easy go. Draw again. Okay, what number you got now, Libby?
949. 949.